Hello everyone, Jeff Holiday here, and today is going to be a little bit of a different type of video than I usually do. This one's going to be highly analytical, and we're going to take it slow, and we're going to try and prove our points as well as we possibly can. Now on my channel, I very commonly talk about social, political issues, not really politics, but socio-political issues, as well as science. Well, in this regard, we're actually going to be doing both. And for that purpose, I want to try and address this with a methodology that can hopefully, if not change minds, maybe at least get some people to question things that they otherwise would have just simply accepted. That's the goal. And because the person that I'm going to be talking about in this video has allegedly used the DMCA system unfairly, I will state at this point that my use of footage is fair use, it is transformative in nature, and it is done for the purposes of criticism as well as review. Today we're going to be talking about race realism, genetics, intelligence, and Stefan Molyneux. Stefan Molyneux, for people who are not aware, he studied history, but right now he runs a radio show with live streaming video where he talks about various different things. And now Stefan has in the past tackled some topics that I think are really important to talk about. He believes in things like virtuous parenting. He believes in tackling some social issues and how children might develop. And in that regard, I do find some of his ideas compelling and interesting, but there are some ideas, especially ones that he's been getting into these past few years, which I find, I hate to say problematic, but there's a problem with them. You see, when you get into the habit of making broad absolutist statements about things that are at least more or less defined in academia, well, you kind of need to actually put forth a compelling argument that is rooted in basic facts. That's how you build a case for whatever it is that you want to be talking about. I feel like Molyneux has started to fail in this regard when he starts talking about race realism. Race realism at its core is not really necessarily something bad. You see, it's trying to look at it in an open and honest way about the differences, the biological differences in different racial demographics. For instance, black people, especially sub-Saharan, have a higher possibility of having sickle cell anemia. That is just an objective biological fact, something that we have observed. As well, white people are more likely to get sunburns, things like that. East Asian people have bifurcated eyes. These are just observable facts that we understand, we can see, we can measure, and we can analyze. There's no point in really trying to debate them because there's really nothing there to debate. But race realism gets into some muddy water when it starts to try and determine things that are not necessarily easily definable by biology or objective factual analysis. And one of those, and it's used a lot these days, actually it's been used for a long time, but it's resurging again now, is intelligence. That's right, we're going to be talking about intelligence among racial demographics. Wow, what a lighthearted topic to tackle. So to tackle this, I have my favorite of my psychology textbooks. This one's written by Schachter, Gilbert, and Wegner. Gilbert, I actually got to meet Dan Gilbert once, and he's fascinating. He's a really, really interesting instructor. I have that, as well as my cell phone full of citations and studies and data. So let's get into it. The basic core question is, what is intelligence? What is intelligence and how can you measure it? And intelligence, by and large, has been defined in many, many different ways. And there is no absolutist parameters that we can actually define intelligence by, because it is predominantly a subjective term. However, people have tried to find ways to make it an actual observable concept. So about 20 some odd years ago, a group of experts came together to try and make one definitive statement of how we can define intelligence. And what they came up with was, intelligence is the ability to direct one's thinking, adapt to one's circumstances, and learn from one's experiences. But that's not really a very good answer either, because intelligence in and of itself, if that is just the compartmentalized version, can describe a high aptitude in one aspect and a low aptitude in the other. So then you have the question of, is that person intelligent or are they not intelligent? This book has an absolutely wonderful, wonderful analogy to get us started. So there's something called Williams syndrome, and Williams syndrome is caused by the absence of 20 genes on chromosome 7. 20 genes, that's a very tiny, tiny amount. And one of the most interesting things about Williams syndrome is it can effectively render you incapable of understanding numbers, doing basic addition, subtraction, as well as being able to determine things like left and right. It's a dysfunction, you could say, and it's not anti-PC to say because it is accurate, is a retardation in certain types of mental faculties. However, what's really fascinating about this is people with Williams syndrome very, very commonly have a high aptitude for music, for literature, for any of the literary arts whatsoever, for creative and artistic expressions. They have a massive appreciation for it and usually can develop really high functioning skills in that regard. Yet, they will probably always need a caretaker of some sort because other basic human tasks just escape them. They can't do it. So then you have this problem. If you have someone with Williams syndrome and they can cite the different aesthetic virtues in a different painting, or they can analyze and eloquently express the different metrics espoused in classical music, yet they can't do 3 + 2 is 5. Are they not intelligent? This is basically the problem with trying to define this term. So because of that, as history went through, we tried to figure out interesting ways to put down a measure, at least as far as it could affect society. And sometimes this has really disastrous effects. In the 1920s, Henry Goddard basically tried to formulate a sort of test to test different mental faculties of different people, especially immigrants coming into America. And what he found was Jews, Hungarians, Italians, and Russians, according to his tests, were unintelligent. And because of that, our country actually put in very racist policies, in so much as to try and segregate certain types of Europeans coming into the country based on this honestly bullshit and you could argue pretty fucking racist test that this guy developed. I mean, of course, we don't necessarily do that today anymore, but there are some people who still think that there's a type of credence to it. And so in the early 20th century, we had Alfred Binet and Theodore Simon trying to develop what we now understand is the intelligence quotient test. And the basic idea behind it was pretty altruistic. What they wanted to do was find a way to measure the development of children so that teachers then could develop remedial studies classes to help those who were lagging behind. Here's another really good quote. Binet and Simon designed their test to measure a child's aptitude for learning independent of the child's prior educational achievement, and it was in this sense that they called theirs a test of natural intelligence. And this is basically done so teachers could understand what a child's mental level was in regards to their classmates. Now, what's fascinating about this is when you start talking about the IQ test, many people will be like, aha, the IQ test, it measures intelligence. Well, no, it doesn't, actually. The IQ test develops a certain type of understanding of a person's aptitude or their capacity for problem solving. There's various different tests that are out there. Some are better than others. Some you could say more accurately measure intelligence, but by and large, it is simply a method for comparison to understand where someone is at and how they can achieve. This does not necessarily lock somebody in that they will always have a ratioed type of IQ score based on anything other than just what the IQ has tested for. And race realists far too often like to use this as a basis for understanding different races' aptitudes for whatever. That this is a problem, well, we're gonna have to get into it pretty heavily. Now, one other thing that we have to mention before we proceed, there is something called deviation IQ, and a lot of times people will say standard deviation score. Now, the deviation IQ is going to be very, very important as we move forward because there are certain ways that the IQ test kicks its own ass on its attempts to try and predict or understand how somebody is going to be testing on the IQ based on the demographic. And we'll get there. Now, there's two commonly used IQ tests. There's the Stanford Binet test and the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, or WAIS. And I'm not going to say that there is no value in testing somebody's intelligence quotient. I'm not going to say that there's no value in there, because it can help to determine what types of areas somebody might want to focus on to increase overall basic cognitive abilities, especially when it relates to whether or not they need to take certain types of classes or not, need to develop certain types of skills or not. And again, this is all relative, because depending on what a person really wants to accomplish in their life, these things might be utterly irrelevant. Again, it basically comes down to the simple fact of what are you trying to achieve, and who is intelligent and who is not intelligent when you're talking about things like arts and creativity versus deep analytical skills or complex calculations. These are wildly different skill sets that can have natural talent or increased learned aptitude that will affect the scores as they come out. Like I said, this is going to be a heavy video. We're talking some deep, serious science shit. So let's talk about the consequence of having a high IQ. It's not unreasonable to assume that if you score very high on aptitude tests, especially when it relates to school, which is usually trying to prepare you for, higher education and then establishing a career. If you show a high aptitude and you show a large degree of working intelligence, then it stands to reason that you have a higher chance of succeeding in college, getting a degree, and getting a job that would require that type of skill set, which commonly pays well. But on the flip side, there are also instances, and I will show them once we're done with all of the science stuff and we get into Stefan Molyneux, where people who embrace race realism to a certain far extent believe that your IQ score can actually measure your objective value in society. And this is really wrong. Really wrong. And what do I mean by that's really wrong? Because it's a subjective notion, and it really depends on how you're going to define value. How do you define value in society? The smart people working as engineers, or the artistic people enriching us with our culture? How do you determine that value? And then how are you going to relate IQ to that? This is very subjective shit that we're talking about. So another big thing that we have to try and understand is intelligence one simple, basic, functional ability, or is it a many-factored, attributed, nebulous term? And I think it's kind of easy to understand which it actually is, but let's give it its due. So in the early 1900s, Charles Spearman attempted to try and figure out what this actually was through a method that he called factor analysis. And he tested a bunch of school children on various different tests of aptitudes. What he found was actually pretty interesting, and they actually call his studies one of the most replicatable analysis in the history of science, because when he was testing these children, he found that there were certain correlatives of different tests that seemed to match up with others. For instance, if you could determine the difference in pitch of musical notes, you had a higher tendency to be good with algebra. But again, when we think back to Williams syndrome, then that necessarily isn't always a good strong correlative, because it largely depends on how your brain functions. But for the basis of this, we're just going to assume that that's an easily provable basic analysis, and we're going to go with that as our starting point. But he summed up his findings as the two-factor theory of intelligence, which suggested that every task requires a combination of general ability and skills that are specific to that task. Now, what's interesting about that is it basically says that there is a component of natural talent or aptitude, and there's also a subset of skills that a person learns. And what I find so fascinating about it too is because if you think about it as a two-step factor, then it's easy to assume. Like if you assume, say, a bar graph, and you have this much natural ability but this many skills, versus somebody who has this much ability and this many skills, do they even out? And that again is a subjective question, but it is something to be aware of, that intelligence, even so far as we understood it in the early 1900s, we still had an idea that it was partially skill-based and it was partially natural talent. And so not everybody always agreed with Spearman's conclusions. And in 1938, Louis Thurstone noticed that while scores on most tests were indeed positively correlated, scores on one kind of verbal test were more highly correlated with scores on another kind of verbal test than they were with scores on perceptual tests. So basically this means that they were scoring correlative true to the verbal component, but not necessarily in other components, especially in cognitive functions or in rationalizing. These were wildly divergent, and it didn't necessarily mean that if you were good in one, you were good in the other. But ones that had similarities had the same correlative data. And so this debate raged for decades and decades and decades. And then in the 1980s, the science basically quieted down and we accepted kind of a basic idea, which is still hotly debated, don't get me wrong, about what intelligence is. And how they put it is, it's a 3-level hierarchy with a general factor, like Spearman's, at the top, specific factors at the bottom, and a set of factors called group factors in the middle. And as they looked back on it, they realized that most of the studies done had pretty much proven this, but the hierarchy level itself had not really been built. This hierarchy suggests that people have a very general ability called intelligence, which is made up of a small set of middle-level abilities, which are made up of a large set of specific abilities that are unique to specific tasks. And this in and of itself was basically proving, again, that there are skills and there are talents, and they're not necessarily correlative to each other. Some can lead to others, and that in and of itself, intelligence is a very complicated measure to try and take. Now, before we get into even more of the biological aspect to this, there's one more thing I really want to tackle. Genetic influences on intelligence is going to be something that we talk about even further as we get into this really heavy discussion. So one of the ways that we did this is we started studying twins. To try and find out basically if there was a wide genetic divergence in intelligence as it relates to environment. And so we understand now that there is, at least to some degree, a biological genetic component to intelligence, or at least as far as we have begun to measure in these tests. However, there's a catch. So if you look at identical twins who are raised in a home, then the gap in their IQ scores is very, very small. And that's in comparison to fraternal twins living in the same home, there is a much wider gap. What's even more interesting than that is if you take identical twins and they're raised in separate homes, they're more likely to have closer IQ scores than fraternal twins raised in the same home. So that would suggest that there is a huge genetic component to it, right? Well, there's also kind of a large problem with it because environment in and of itself does have a huge role to play in IQ scores and intelligence at large. And so the problem with this kind of study and statistical data is that most of the time these are identical twins, even if they're raised in a different home, but in the same country and more or less around the same culture. And this will become even more apparent the further we get on. And how we measure this is basically something called the heritability coefficient. All right, so for the most part, that seems pretty self-explanatory, right? We understand that there might be a biological component. We understand that it's very nuanced between aptitude and skills for how we measure intelligence, as best we can measure intelligence. Seems fine, right? Well, there's something else I'd like to add. You see, the aptitude or the capacity for intelligence also has a biological component that is separate entirely from just genes or from environment. There's something called neural branching. As you study neurology, if you study neurology, which I do, then you understand that one of the ways that our biology it reacts to learning is through the dendrites, or the branching off of neural cells in our brain and in our spinal column, but largely in our brain, especially our prefrontal cortex. Imagine it like a tree branches spreading out from a single cell. Now on each of those branches are tinier branches and tinier branches and tinier branches. And as you use basic aspects of your brain with rationalizing thing, mathematics, spatial relations, distinguishing tonal types can correlate to different parts of your brain that do that type of processing. And the more you stimulate that part of your brain, the more that these branches start developing off the other branches. And as these branches branch, they connect to more neurons and more branches. They start to weave together. And so the more you use your brain, quite literally, the smarter you become. Or at least the easier it is for information to transfer through the various different neurons. One of the most amazing aspects of our human brain is that simply by using it, it improves. In that way, it's even more powerful than a muscle that you work out, because it in and of itself just becomes a more complicated and more efficient biological processing machine. It's fascinating. And that's another one of the reasons why people who engage in things that are stimulating, and this can even be as simple as exercise. Exercise can help improve your brain, believe it or fucking not, as well as reading, listening to music, engaging in problem-solving skills. Some do more than others, and they have relatable parts of our brain that it enhances. So, and forgive me, like this kind of stuff, neurology, neuroscience is just so fascinating to me. And understanding how neurons grow and develop and branch by its very nature, for me, counters the absolutist biological viewpoint that race will always determine what your intelligence is. And that's why I find these ideas so horrifying.
Now, because I don't want this to take terribly too long, we're actually going to split this up into 2 parts, 2 different videos, so it's easier to pause and maybe watch the next one afterwards, and we'll get directly into what Molyneux's claims actually are.
Species is not biologically valid. We are a variety of subspecies, politically, ethnically sometimes, definitely in terms of gender, in terms of IQ, in terms of culture. These produce physical brain differences that are very hard to remediate when you get older.